Hello and welcome to Sunset Zen and Sleepy Stories. Please relax, listen, and enjoy. Everything the Rain Remembers. A third story from Heron Inlet. Being a gentle account of one Nora, one Daniel, the winter coast, and what grows back slowly in the dark. There is a particular quality to the light in the Pacific Northwest in the deep middle of winter. Not darkness exactly, but a softening of everything, a lowering of the sky until it seems almost close enough to touch, a diffusion of whatever light there is so that the world exists without shadows, without hard edges, without strong opinions of direct sun. Everything is held in a kind of even gray tenderness, and the trees under that sky are very dark, and the water under that sky is very still, and the rain, when it comes, and it comes often, falls with an almost courteous discretion, as though it has learned long ago that the Pacific Northwest does not need to be persuaded. It already knows. It has already consented. Nora arrived on a Wednesday in January. She had driven up from the city in a car that still smelled of the boxes she had been unpacking, or perhaps repacking. She was not, she admitted to no one, entirely sure what she was doing. The apartment she had moved into 3 months ago was not quite a home yet, and might not become one, and she was keeping that possibility at arm's length, the way you keep a door open in a room you might need to leave quickly. She was 38 years old, and she had recently ended a long marriage with a quietness that had surprised everyone who knew her, including herself. People expected grief to be louder than this, or perhaps she was louder about it privately. She hadn't decided yet. The drive north had taken 4 hours, and for most of it she had not listened to anything. No music, no podcasts, nothing. Just the sound of the highway, and then the smaller roads, and then no road she could name. The trees pressing close on both sides, the alders bare and white, making their tunnel over the lane, and the rain beginning softly as she turned onto the gravel, as though it had been waiting. She found the house by the hand-drawn map which had appeared in her inbox the morning after she'd booked, and which she had printed out and folded in her coat pocket. The fallen madrone, the fork where both ways look wrong, the gate that was always open. And then the house itself, its amber windows set into the dark of the trees like the eyes of something large and warm and patient, and the smoke from the chimney going straight up in the still January air, and the sound she registered before anything else, standing beside her car with her bag in her hand, and the rain beginning on her shoulders, the ocean, low, continuous, everywhere and nowhere, a sound like the edge of sleep. Marin was at the door before Nora reached the porch steps, and she took Nora's bag from her hand with the matter-of-fact ease of someone for whom a guest's hands should be empty upon arrival. And she said simply, "Come in out of the cold." And Nora came in. The warmth of the house was immediate and complete, not the sudden dry blast of the central heating, but something more diffuse and older, the warmth of wood and fire and walls that had been absorbing heat for decades, the warmth of a house that has been lived in carefully for a very long time. A fire in the stone hearth, The low beam above the kitchen counter hung with bundles of dried things, rosemary, lavender, something silvery and unfamiliar, small dried rosebuds tied with undyed twine. On the counter, a pot at a very low simmer, its lid just slightly ajar, releasing a thin breath of steam that smelled of something gentle and root-like and sweet. Maren hung Nora's coat on a hook and set her wet shoes near the fire and brought her to the kitchen table and poured her a small glass of something amber. An apple brandy, she said, from an orchard up the road, without asking. It was barely sweet. It was very warm, tasting of autumn and oak and something faintly smoky about the finish. And Nora wrapped her hands around the glass and sat at the table and felt for the first time in some months that she was allowed to simply stop moving. There was one other guest, a man named Daniel, who appeared from the hallway with a book under his arm and the mild, self-contained look of someone who had been here at least a day and had already settled into the house's peculiar rhythm. He was perhaps 45, with a kind of quietness that comes not from shyness, but from having recently learned the value of not filling every silence. He nodded at Nora, said his name, and sat down at the far end of the table with his book, which was a paperback of such age that its spine had been repaired with tape and read without speaking, which Nora found not unfriendly, but deeply, unexpectedly considerate. Maren moved through the kitchen in her unhurried way. She was making a mushroom broth. She mentioned, not as an announcement, but as someone might mention it is Tuesday, just a fact of the present moment. And she had put it on in the morning with dried porcini and fresh shiitake and onion and a whole head of garlic and a piece of kombu, and it would be ready when it was ready. She spoke of it with the particular affection of someone describing a process they trust completely. Outside, the rain had steadied. The windows of the kitchen faced east toward the inlet, and in the dark, glass reflected on the interior back at itself. The firelight, the bundles of herbs, the copper pot hanging from its hook, Nora sitting with her glass of brandy and her hands on the table, her face doing something between exhaustion and the early tentative relaxation of a person who has not quite believed they were allowed to rest. Maren set a bowl in front of her without preamble. The broth was the color of dark honey, clear and deep, and it smelled of the forest floor in autumn, and something faintly mineral, and something warm and round that she could not name, but that felt, on the first sip, like the inside of a very old and trusted house. There were thin slices of mushroom floating in it, and a tangle of soba noodles that had been cooked separately and added at the last moment, and a single soft-cooked egg, halved, its yolk the color of a winter sunrise, and a scattering of thinly sliced scallions and a few drops of sesame oil that made small golden circles on the surface. She ate slowly. The fire breathed. The rain said what rain says. Her room was the sandpiper room at the top of the stairs, its windows facing west toward the invisible ocean. The wallpaper was old and botanical, small repeated sprigs of something that might have been sea lavender, and the floor was a dark fur, worn smooth, with a braided rug in blues and greens beside the bed. The bed was high and dressed in white linen and a quilt made of many different fabrics, mostly blues and greens and the occasional unexpected amber, that had weight and softness of something made by hand a long time ago with care for someone specific. On the bedside table, a lamp with a cream shade, a glass of water, a ceramic dish containing 2 squares of dark chocolate dusted with the faintest trace of sea salt, and a sprig of something green and fresh. Rosemary, she thought, or perhaps something from the garden she didn't know, laying simply on a white cloth beside the dish as though just placed there. She lay in the high bed and listened. Rain on the roof, soft and insistent percussion that was not anxious but rhythmic and deep. The drip from the eaves at irregular intervals, and below all of it, threading through the walls and the window glass and the roof above her, the ocean, pulling back, pushing in, pulling back, the most patient sound in the world. She had not expected to sleep easily. She had not slept easily in months, always waking at 3 or 4 into the specific gray territory of unresolved things, the inventory of what had been lost and what remained, and what she was supposed to do with either. But the bed was deep, and the quilt was warm, and the rain said its patient, repetitive nothing, and the ocean went on below everything like a very slow heartbeat. And she was asleep before she had finished the thought she had been thinking, which she would not remember in the morning. And she slept without waking until light came, gray and soft through the west window, and a bird she didn't know called once, clearly from somewhere in the hemlocks. In the morning, Marin was in the garden when Nora came downstairs, visible through the kitchen window, a dark coat, barn boots moving along the beds with a basket over her arm, and the unhurried quality of someone doing something that needs doing, but is not in a hurry about it. The garden was the January version of itself, spare and structural, the raised beds mostly bare earth under their straw covers, but with certain things persisting. Dark kale in the far corner, its leaves so deeply green they were almost black, beaded with water. A low mound of what might have been thyme or oregano, still green, still holding. The tall skeletal remains of last summer's fennel, bronze and fragile, with their umbrella forms still intact against the gray sky, the rain beating on the thin stems. Marin was cutting kale. She cut it slowly, leaving the lower leaves on the plant and taking from the top, and she paused sometimes to look at a leaf more closely before taking it, as though she and the plant were in consultation about what was appropriate. Nora stood at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee, which had appeared on the counter, already made, as though the house anticipated arrivals at the coffee level, and watched her, and felt something that was close to peace, but still had some distance to go to get there. Still, it was closer than yesterday. She was noticing that the distance was closing in small increments, and this seemed worth noticing. When Marin came back inside with her basket, she moved immediately and naturally to the counter and began washing the kale in the big stone sink. And Nora asked if she could help, and Marin handed her a peeler and a pile of parsnips without turning around. They stood side by side at the counter for 20 minutes, Nora peeling parsnips and Marin tearing kale into pieces of her preferred size, and the kitchen smelled of earth and wet greens and coffee in the faint resiny sweetness of the fire in the next room. And neither of them talked for a while, which was not uncomfortable, but was, in fact, the most comfortable Nora had felt in months. "The fennel," Nora eventually said, looking out the window of the garden. "You left it standing." I leave things that make good structure in the winter. The birds use them, and they're beautiful, the bones of things." Nora looked at the fennel against the gray sky. The bones of things, she thought, and understood what Marin meant, and also thought it applied to more than the garden. "Does anything grow in January?" she asked. "More than you'd think," Marin said. She wiped her hands on her apron and pointed. "Kale, obviously. Sorrel, if it's been mild. The chives come back every year, earlier than you would expect them to. Parsley makes it through most winters here, and the winter aconite will start sometime this month. Little yellow flowers, very small, very close to the ground, right through the frost." She paused. "They're the ones that remind you that it's already turning, even when you can't see it yet." Nora peeled the last parsnip and set it in the bowl and looked out the window at the bare and rain-dark beds. She tried to imagine yellow flowers coming up through the frost, and found she could. Breakfast that morning was the parsnips, roasted until their edges had caramelized into something almost jammy and sweet, served alongside a potato and leek hash that Marin had made in a large skillet with a confidence born of having made it many times, pressing the hash down to crisp in the fat and then letting it be, not fussing, turning it only once, and eggs from the 4 hens who lived in a coop at the side of the house, and whose eggs were small and dark-yolked and tasted something Nora could only describe as more than eggs. Marin said nothing special about any of it, just set the plates down and filled the coffee cups, and sat for a few minutes with her own cup while Daniel came in from outside, where he had been standing on the porch looking at the rain, and they ate together without ceremony, which was its own kind of ceremony. Daniel, Nora learned over the following days, was a former school teacher who had retired early to care for his mother, and who had come here in the weeks after her death, recently enough that he was still in the raw first part of grief, where everything was a little too bright and a little too loud, and he had not yet developed the callous that comes with time. He talked about it directly when he did talk about it, which was something Nora had not expected, but found enormously refreshing. He said his mother had been difficult and wonderful in equal measure, and that losing her felt like losing a whole era, which was precisely what it was. "You lose the person," he said one morning over coffee, not looking at Nora but at the window, "and then you lose everything attached to the person. All the small things you didn't know you were keeping, the way she answered the phone, the specific wrong way she said certain words, the recipe for the thing that she made that nobody else could make." He paused. "You don't know what you're holding until your hands are empty." Nora thought about this. She thought she knew something about empty hands, and was not yet sure what she was going to put in them. The shore path began at the back of the garden, through the gate, past the compost bins with their slow, steaming industry, into the forest which closed around you within 20 paces and remade the world completely. Inside the forest, the rain was mediated. The canopy of hemlock and fir absorbed the worst of it, and what came through fell in larger drops at longer intervals. A slower rain, a translated rain. The ground was deep and soft, with decades of fallen needles, dark, brown, and springy underfoot. And the sword ferns that lined the trail were enormous, waist-high some of them, their fronds arching over the path in a green canopy that caught the drops and bent under their weight, and then released them in small bright showers. Nora walked it alone on the second morning, in the rubber boots she'd found at the door in approximately her size, in the long waxed canvas coat that smelled of other people's good walks. The trail went west through the old growth and then climbed slightly, the trees larger as she went, and she found herself doing what you do in old-growth forests, looking up. The trunks rose without branches for 50, 60, 70 feet, and then became suddenly complex at the top, where the light was, where the crowns opened in every direction, and the small birds moved through them with quick, purposeful industry. Below, everything was still. Below, the sound of the rain and the canopy above, and the sound of the trail underfoot, and growing, deepening sounds of the ocean ahead. The beach was narrow and dark-sanded, curving north and south on long arcs, bound to the north by the great basalt headline, and to the south by a gentler point, where the forest came down almost to the water. The tide was low. She had not known this was coming, and found it felt like a gift. And the exposed sand was wide and ridged, and in the pools left behind by the retreating water, there were small transparent shrimps and the occasional stranded moon jelly, translucent and still, like a thought not yet fully formed. She walked south first, into the wind, which was not strong today, but steady and cold and salt-smelling, and it moved her hair and reddened her cheeks and made her feel, after a few minutes, very awake and very specifically located in her body, which was a thing she had been less attentive to than she should have been, for longer than she wanted to admit. She had been living for some time, mostly in the part of herself above the shoulders, the anxious, calculating part, the part that ran worst-case scenarios and negotiated with uncertainty and tried to maintain a forward-facing composure. The rest of her had been managed rather than inhabited. The ocean did not permit this. The ocean requires your whole body, the cold on your face, the sand shifting under the rubber boots, the sound that was not just sound but physical pressure in your chest, your sternum resonating faintly with each large wave. You could not stand on that beach and be only a mind. There was too much else happening. She walked to the southern point and stood on the last rocks above the waterline and looked out. The sea was today the color of old pewter, not quite green, not quite gray, something between, with a slight iridescence where the swells caught what little light came out of the clouds. The swells moved from the southwest in long, even lines, each one a small geography, a gentle rise, a crest, a fall, and where they hit the rocks, the water organized itself into spray that rose and caught in the wind and went sideways, tasting of salt, landing on her face, on her hands, on the front of the waxed coat. She stood there for a long time. She did not think about the apartment, or the boxes, or the marriage, or what came next. She thought, insofar as she thought at all, only about what was directly in front of her, which was the ocean spending itself completely on the rocks of the Pacific Northwest coast, and doing so with no apparent suffering and considerable beauty. She found this instructive. She was not sure yet how precisely, but she found it instructive. On the walk back, she went slowly, stopping when something stopped her. A rough-skinned newt crossing the trail with the preoccupied dignity of an animal that has somewhere to be, and is taking exactly as long as it takes to get there. A stand of red alder, whose smooth gray bark had been colonized by lichen in 3 colors. The pale silvery green of Falwes lichen, the orange of a species she didn't know the name of, the white of another, until the trunks looked like maps of imagined countries. A nurse log so fully covered in moss that it had become a landscape rather than a tree. A long rolling green mound with sword ferns growing from its back and a small hemlock, already 8 feet tall, rooted in its center, getting its first purchase on the future. She crouched beside the nurse log and put her hand on the moss, and it gave under her fingers like something breathing. Beneath the green surface, the wood was fully soft now, not rotten in any unpleasant sense, but simply in process, slowly becoming soil, giving its substance up to the moss and the ferns and the young hemlock, in a transaction so gradual and complete it had no drama left in it. It was just what happened. The tree fell, and then the tree became the next thing. She stayed crouched there for a while with her hand on the moss and the rain coming through the canopy in its slow translated drops, and the forest very quiet around her, and the ocean just audible below the other sounds, patient and continuous, going on. On the third day, the rain settled into a serious and sustained effort. No longer the intermittent showers of the first 2 days, but a proper January storm, gray and purposeful, with a wind that moved through the firs in long rushing waves, and sent the rain against the west-facing windows at an angle that made it sound like something was being poured. The inlet disappeared into the weather. The garden was barely visible. The hens had retreated to their coops, sensible creatures, and the only birds Nora could see from the window were a pair of juncos moving under the cedar near the kitchen door, their white tail feathers flashing as they hopped through the debris the wind had brought down. Nobody went outside that day, and this turned out to be entirely sufficient. The house was its own weather system, its own climate. Marin lit the fire early, and it burned all day, and Daniel sat beside it with his book and his long silences, and Nora sat at the other end of the couch with the notepad she had brought, and did not write much, but found the act of having it open in her lap a comfort, as though she were keeping the possibility of words without forcing them. Marin cooked all day. She did not cook frantically or even particularly purposefully. She moved in and out of the kitchen at a pace that was entirely her own, doing things in her sequence, in her timing. But by the end of the day, she had made more food than Nora had seen produced in a domestic kitchen in years. Not excessive, just thorough, in the way of someone who understands that a storm day is a gift of time and knows exactly what to do with it. In the morning she made porridge from steel-cut oats that she had left soaking overnight, cooked slowly with a small amount of salt and nothing else, until the oats had fully surrendered their starchiness and become something thick and yielding and slightly glossy, and she served it with a small, warm pitcher of cream, and a dish of dark brown sugar, and a spoonful of plum preserve she had made in August from the little plum tree at the edge of the garden, which was sour and deep and tasted somehow of the last warm light of the year. By mid-morning she was at the counter with bread dough, a slow sourdough she had started the night before, which had spent the cool hours developing its particular complexity, and she folded and turned it with practiced care, and left it covered under a cloth, and went and sat by the fire for 20 minutes with her own coffee, and looked at the storm with an expression of mild satisfaction, as though the weather had done exactly what she expected, and she found this appropriate. At noon she made soup, a long simmered chicken broth that had been in the cold pantry since Tuesday, brought back to a gentle boil with sliced carrots and celery and the kale from the garden, and wide flat noodles she made from scratch in a process that involved the pasta machine from the shelf above the refrigerator, and a great deal of flour on the counter, and a patience Nora found beautiful to watch. The noodles went in at the last moment, and were done in 2 minutes, and the soup was the color of a deep gold, and the noodles were silky, and the kale retained just enough bite to remind you it had once been a plant in the garden in the rain. and Marin sat out on the table with the sourdough, now baked, its crust the color of mahogany and smelling of everything good about bread, and a dish of butter. Daniel looked at the soup bowl for a moment before he picked up his spoon. "My mother made soup like this," he said quietly, not to anyone in particular. He said it without grief exactly, or with grief held gently, the way you would hold something fragile without gripping it. Marin said nothing, just refilled his water glass and went back to the kitchen. By afternoon, the kitchen smelled of caramelizing onions, which is one of the most consoling smells in the world. Sweet and patient and deeply savory, the smell of time applied to a simple thing until it becomes something far more than itself. Marin was making a tart, a caramelized onion and Gruyere tart, in a shell of short pastry she had made without looking at a recipe, her hands working the butter into the flour with a lightness that was almost musical. The onions had been cooking for an hour, low heat, frequent stirring, slowly getting on from white to gold to amber to a deep sweet brown that held their shape, but barely. She spread them into the shell and poured over an egg and a cream custard, scented with a little thyme and nutmeg, and put it in the oven, and the smell that came out when it was baked was something Nora decided she would keep in her memory specifically and deliberately, a thing to take home. Tea appeared at 3 p.m. without discussion. The amber tea, the one that smelled of the forest and tasted of chamomile and something deeper and woodsier and more ancient. Marin set it on the low table near the fire with a small plate of shortbread she had made from some recipe in her hands rather than in any book, rounds of pale gold pastry that crumbled at the edge of the bite and tasted of butter and a very slight floral sweetness she said was lavender from the summer garden, dried and kept in a jar. Nora drank her tea and ate her shortbread and listened to the storm on the windows and the fire in the hearth, and Daniel turning a page, and somewhere below it all, still there, still working, the ocean. She thought, I had forgotten that days could be like this, not productive, not forward-moving, just full, in the way that deep water is full, not of things, but of substance, of presence, of the simple weight of being somewhere in particular and allowing it to be enough. Dinner was the tart, served warm in wedges, with a salad of bitter greens and thin-sliced fennel and toasted walnuts in a mustardy vinaigrette that cut through the richness of the custard with exactly the necessary acidity. And then Marin brought from the cold pantry a small wheel of cheese, a washed rind cheese from a creamery 30 miles north, soft and orange rinded, and smelling powerfully of itself, the way of such cheeses, which do not apologize, and crackers she had made from rye and sesame that were thin and brittle and perfect. And then, as though she had nearly forgotten it and remembered, a bowl of poached pears, firm Bosque pears, peeled and halved and poached in red wine, with star anise and cinnamon and a stripe of orange peel, until they had gone the color of garnet and absorbed the wine's depth and the spice's warmth. And she served them over a spoonful of thick cream that had been barely sweetened with honey and left to thicken in the cold overnight. The pears were, Nora thought, almost too beautiful to eat, and then she ate one and revised her thinking entirely. The storm raged distantly at the windows, the fire burned, the candles on the table, short ones in low glass holders, 3 of them unscented, made the familiar warm mathematics of candlelight, the flickering and the warmth of the shadows moving on the walls. Daniel told a story about his mother teaching him to make pasta by hand when he was 9 years old, and getting it completely wrong the first time, and laughing about it for years afterwards. And as he told, he was laughing, quietly, in the present tense. and the laughing and the grief were not separate things, but the same thing, held together in the telling. Maren listened with her chin in her hand and her eyes on him, fully present, fully attending, as though what Daniel was saying were the most important thing happening anywhere in the world at that moment, which, Nora thought, watching her, perhaps it was. The storm blew itself out overnight, and the fourth day arrived clear, or not clear exactly, because clear is not quite the right word for a Pacific Northwest winter sky. Even at its best retains a certain layered quality, a depth of gray behind the gray, the suggestion of more weather behind the current weather. But the rain had stopped, and the wind had dropped to something that moved the tops of the firs in a gentle, idle conversation rather than the previous day's serious dispute. And there was quality of light that was almost blue, which in January felt generous. Maren told them over breakfast, soft scrambled eggs with creme fraiche and chives on toast made from the end of the sourdough loaf, very good, that the low tide would be at 11, and that the tidal pools at the base of the headland were worth seeing after a storm, when the swell had stirred things up and the pools were replenished, and various creatures had been rearranged into new configurations. She said this as information and left them to do with it what they would. They went together, Nora and Daniel, finding themselves at the back door at the same time, and walking the shore path in companionable silence. The forest after the storm was dramatically itself, branches down, puddles that were more like small ponds on the low parts of the trail, the air smelling of knocked, loosed bark, and wet earth and something faintly electric, the residue of a night of serious weather. The sword ferns had been beaten flat in places and were slowly recovering, lifting themselves back towards the horizontal with a millimeter by millimeter determination that Nora found moving in a way she did not try to articulate. The beach was transformed. The storm had redrawn it. New logs pushed up above the high tide line, draped with kelp and long dark ribbons, and the red-orange lace of Turkish towel algae, and the feathery green of sea lettuce still holding its color. The sand had been regraded, scoured clean, and there were long ridges and troughs where the swells had reorganized everything in the night. The air was cold and very clean, and tasted the back of the throat of the deep ocean. The tidal pools at the headland were intricate small worlds, each one different, each one complete. They crouched beside them in bright cold air and looked. A pool edged with pink coralline algae, a pink so unlikely in this gray world that it seemed almost implausible, a vivid rose pink that branched and crusted over every surface, like a very slow and beautiful fire. The deeper center of the pool, beneath the surface, a cluster of green anemones, their tentacles withdrawn after the storm's disturbance, their bodies closed into smooth olive cylinders, waiting for the right signal to open again. A small ochre sea star, splayed on the far wall of the pool, each arm slightly different in tone, orange here, brown there, the color of it not quite decided. Possessor Ocarius, said Daniel, then catching himself. I used to teach biology, old habit. How do you know? The shape, the color, though they're variable. He crouched closer, studying it. They can live 20 years. They're a keystone species. Without them, the muscles take over everything. He paused. One animal holding a whole ecosystem in balance. They looked at the sea star. It did not appear to be aware of its responsibilities. In the next pool, a hermit crab in a moon snail shell twice its parent size, hauling itself across the bottom with an ungainly determination that was almost heroic. In another, a small fish, a tide pool sculpin, so well camouflaged against the rock that Nora stared directly at it for several seconds before her eyes resolved it from the background and found its fish shape hiding in plain sight. The large head, the wide mouth, the mottled coloring of something that has learned to be the thing it sits on. They spent an hour at the pools. They spoke occasionally, mostly naming things. Mostly Daniel, because he knew the names and seemed to find comfort in using them and having the names to give things. Nora found she liked not knowing the names and learning them and then having them. It felt like a small, specific filling of something. On the walk back, Daniel said, "Do you believe in this sort of thing?" He gestured vaguely, which she took to mean the house, Marin, the general experience of being here and finding it unexpectedly restorative. "I didn't think I did," Nora said. "I'm not sure what I think now." "I'm a biologist by training," Daniel said. "Former biology teacher. I'm professionally skeptical of anything I can't measure." He walked a few steps. "But I slept 10 hours last night. I haven't slept more than 5 since October." The trail moved through a stand of young alder, their pale trunks glowing in the winter light, the catkins already forming, small and green, prepared for spring, which was still months away. "Maybe it's just the air," Nora said. "Maybe," said Daniel. He didn't sound convinced. He didn't sound unconvinced either. He sounded like someone who had decided, for now, that the question itself was less important than the fact of the 10 hours. Marin had a habit, Nora had noticed it by the 3rd day, and by the 4th had begun to study it, of responding to the unspoken, not through anything mysterious, not through any declared insight. She simply paid attention with such completeness that the things people were not saying became visible to her, and she addressed them quietly, indirectly, through what she put on the table or on the walk she suggested, or the book she left on the arm of the chair. On the evening of the 4th day, Nora was sitting at the kitchen table, writing in her notepad, writing properly this time, the words coming from somewhere she hadn't been able to access in the city. And Marin came in from the garden with a small bunch of something she had cut from the winter beds and set in a glass of water on the windsill, without comment. It was winter aconite, small yellow flowers on short stems, exactly as she had described them. Each petal a clear, warm yellow, and at the center a deeper gold, and the whole cluster no larger than a child's fist, but unmistakably, stubbornly spring-colored, spring-scented even in January. Nora looked at them for a long moment. She thought about the thing Marin had said on the first morning. "They remind you it's already turning, even when you can't see it yet," and felt the truth of it land somewhere in her chest with a gentleness that was almost physical. She kept writing. On the 5th morning, her second to last, she came downstairs early and found Marin at the table doing something she had not seen her do before, sitting still with a cup of tea, looking out the window at the inlet, not doing anything, just looking. The morning was gray and very quiet, the water in the inlet barely moving, a silver mirror with a slight imperfection where a light current moved through the center. 2 buffalo heads diving near the far bank, the black and white of the males improbable in the low light. Nora poured her own coffee and sat down across from her, and Marin did not seem startled or rearranged, just looked at Nora and then back at the window, and they sat together in the early quiet and watched the inlet and the buffalo heads and the slow gray light coming up over the firs on the far bank. And it was the most natural thing in the world, and also, somehow, the thing Nora had needed most. After a while she said, "How do you keep doing it? Having people come through with all their She gestured loosely. Difficulty. Doesn't it get heavy? Marin considered this for a long time, long enough that Nora thought perhaps she wasn't going to answer. People aren't their difficulty, she said finally. Their difficulty is just what is happening to them in the moment. Underneath it, she paused, looking for the word. They're themselves, which is interesting, always interesting. She drank her tea. The difficulty passes, the person stays. Nora thought about being a person underneath her difficulty. She was not entirely sure she had been giving much thought to that person lately. She had been so occupied with the difficulty. What if the person doesn't know who they are anymore? She asked, and was not surprised to hear herself say it, because it had been true for months, and was simply, this morning, ready to be said aloud. Marin did not answer immediately. A cormorant flew low over the inlet, its dark shape a long, direct line, purposeful and fast. It was gone into the trees on the far bank. Not knowing who you are, Marin said slowly, is different from not being anyone. She looked at Nora with the direct, unperforming attention that was her particular quality. You are here. You're watching the buffleheads. You walked to the shore yesterday and put your hand on a nurse log. A pause. That's someone. That's quite a lot of someone, actually. Outside, the buffleheads dove and resurfaced and dove again. The inlet moved its quiet silver movement. The light continued its slow business of arriving. On the 6th day, the last full day, the rain came back, but gently, a January rain that had lost its ambition, falling more out of habit than conviction, the sky low and soft, the whole world muffled and close. Nora walked the shore one final time in the afternoon, alone, and she walked slowly and paid attention in the way she had been learning, or perhaps relearning, attending to the specific rather than the general, to this wave rather than to the ocean, to the stone rather than to the beach, to this exact moment of rain on her face rather than the abstract fact of weather. The beach was calm today, the swells small and regular, arriving and spending themselves with a tired, gentle grace. At the tide line, a drift of feathers, the remains of something that had been a seabird, now reduced to feathers and scattered bones of the idea of a bird, slowly returning to the general substance of the beach. She crouched and looked at the feathers, which were extraordinary up close. The outer primaries long and pointed and white-quilled, and the inner feathers softer, more complex in color, a deep gray-brown at the base, going white at the tip, in a gradient as precise as anything made on purpose. She picked one up, a primary flight feather, stiff and curved and beautiful, and held it for a moment, and then set it back down with the others. She walked to the headland and stood in what had become her customary place at the base of the rocks and watched the ocean. The swells today were long and gentle, and where they hit the rock they rose quietly, a slow upswelling rather than the explosive impact of the storm days, and the spray that came off them was fine and drifted rather than flew. She felt it on her face, cold and salt, and breathed it in, and stood there long enough for the cold to move through the coat and the layers beneath and become simply the temperature of the world, which was the temperature of January in the Pacific Northwest, which was cold enough to feel entirely real. She thought about going home. She thought about the apartment and the boxes and the decision about whether she was unpacking or repacking and which one she would choose. She thought about the notepad on the table upstairs, which now had 30 pages of her own handwriting in it, not solutions, not plans, just thoughts arriving and being received, just words for things she had not had words for before. She thought about her hands, which were at her sides, which were empty, and about what she might put in them. She thought about the nurse log and the young hemlock already growing from its center, already 8 feet tall, already committed to the future. She thought, I am not the person I was, and that is not only a loss. She stayed with this thought, and the ocean stayed with her. That evening, Marin made a celebration of nothing in particular, or of everything in general, which amounted to the same thing. She had spent the afternoon in the kitchen, and the smells that came from it changed by the hour. First something sweet and spiced, then something savory and deep, then the particular warm darkness of chocolate. For the table, a whole roasted salmon, which had been delivered by the same unseen person as the fish of the week before, brought to the back door in a cloth that Marin unwrapped with care. She had stuffed it with lemon and fennel fronds, and fresh dill from the small pot on the kitchen windowsill, and rubbed the skin with oil and salt, and roasted it in the big oven at a high heat for exactly the right number of minutes, so that the skin was crisp and the flesh beneath was barely done, still faintly translucent at the thickest part, yielding to the fork in large soft flakes that tasted of the sea with a clean directness that needed nothing added. She served it with a sauce of creme fraiche, horseradish, and more fresh dill, a dish of roasted new potatoes with garlic and thyme, wintergreens sautéed with olive oil, and a squeeze of lemon, and a grain dish she had made from farro, the round, chewy grains, nutty and tender, tossed with roasted beets and walnuts, and a sharp crumble of goat cheese, and the last of the fresh parsley from the garden. It was a meal of such balance and completeness, each thing complementing the others, nothing competing, nothing excessive, that Nora found herself eating slowly, not from restraint, but from a desire to stay inside it for as long as possible. Daniel ate with a quiet intensity, and then set his fork down and looked at the table and said, I need to learn to cook properly. He said this with the decisiveness of someone who has just made the decision that has been forming for some time without their quite noticing. Marin looked at him. Start with stock, she said. Make stock. Once you have good stock, everything else is easier. Stock, Daniel repeated, as though adding it to a list. And then Marin brought from the kitchen the dessert, a chocolate cake of modest circumference and considerable dignity, dark and dense, barely sweet, made from a good chocolate and very little else, served in thin slices with a spoonful of barely sweetened cream and a few dried sour cherries she had kept in brandy sent autumn, which were dark and yielding and tasted of summer remembered from a distance. The cake was the kind of thing that does not announce itself as extraordinary, but is, and that you remember for years as the best version of itself you ever ate. After dinner they sat by the fire, the three of them, and the rain was soft on the windows, and the fire made its small adjustments, and the candles burned low, and the house held them in its old, warm walls. They talked easily, the way people talk when they have been in the same place for several days, and the social effort has been worn away by proximity and shared meals, leaving something more natural and less defended. They talked about Daniel's plans, which were beginning to have shape, the paper which he had been putting off, a journey to see his sister in New Mexico, cooking lessons which he had just decided. They talked about Nora's notepad and what was in it, which she could not precisely describe except to say that it was something to do with what she wanted next, and that she had been surprised by what she had written. Marin listened and added, and laughed once at something Daniel said, a real laugh unheld, which Nora realized she had not heard from her before, and which somehow completed a picture she had building of the woman all week. She woke at dawn on the last morning and dressed in the early dark and went to the shore one final time. She did not debate it, she simply went, out the door and through the garden and into the forest, where the trail was dark and soft, and the hemlock drops fell in their slow translation of the rain above, and the ocean grew from suggestion to a presence, to a sound that was everywhere, the way some important things become everywhere once you have fully let them in. The beach in the early light was the most beautiful she had ever seen it. The tide was neither in nor out, but somewhere perfectly between, and the water was dark, and the sky above the water was a deep, bruised blue, just beginning to lighten at the horizon to the south. And the swells came in clean and even and broke in a line of white that ran the length of the visible beach and hissed back through the sand in a long exhale. Oyster catchers moved at the water line, their red bills vivid against the dark sand and the dark water, their calls high and piping, the first non-ocean sound of the morning. She walked slowly and stopped at her stone near the headland and looked at the ocean with particular attention she had been practicing all week. She looked at the swells moving under the surface that looked flat from a distance and was, up close, in constant subtle motion, lifting and falling, reflecting the changing sky, not the same for 2 consecutive seconds. She looked at the way each wave organized itself from the general motion of the sea, rising, cohering, breaking, spending itself entirely, returning. She looked at the headland, at the dark basalt streaked with the white of accumulated minerals, at the mussels clustered in the lower crevices, their shells closed, blue-black and patient, waiting for the tide to return and bring them what they needed. She looked at all of it for a long time, with the cold air on her face, and the salt on her lips, and the oyster catchers calling somewhere to the south. She thought, this will keep being here, and I can come back to this. And then, most importantly, most quietly, I am different now than I was when I arrived, in a way I trust. The difference was not a fixing of anything. The things that had ended had ended. The future was still undrawn. The apartment was still full of boxes, in some uncertain state between arriving and departing. But there was something in her chest that had not been there a week ago. Not hope exactly, which could be disappointed, but something more fundamental than hope. Something that came from being in a body on a beach in January, with the ocean going about its enormous, ancient, patient work regardless. Something that said, the world is still real, and you are in it, and that is enough to go on with. She walked back through the forest with her hands in her pockets, and her face still cold from the wind, and her boots dark with sand, and the hemlock drops fell on her shoulder. And the morning birds were beginning, a wren first, absurdly loud for its size, and then a song sparrow, and then the long, ringing, single note of the varied thrush, which sounds like a question and is answered only by silence, and then another note, and then silence again. Breakfast on a last morning was always, Nora had come to understand, a particular expression of something Marin felt but did not say. This morning it was a Dutch baby, a puffed oven pancake, golden and dramatic in its iron skillet, its edges risen and crisped, and its center soft and eggy and yielding, served with a cascade of thin sliced pears, sautéed in butter and brown sugar and a little cardamom until they had gone translucent and honeyed, a dusting of powdered sugar that dissolved as you watched. It arrived at the table enormous and beautiful and already beginning to deflate at the edges, because Dutch babies do not wait and should not be asked to. And Marin cut it with a practiced ease and served it warm, and they ate it standing at first around the skillet, which Nora felt was not informal so much as right, as the natural way to eat a thing like this on a morning like this. Daniel was leaving after her, and was still eating his second piece when she brought her bag down. He stood to say goodbye and pressed her hand and said, "Good luck with the boxes," in a way that meant something more than boxes. And she said, "Start with stock," back to him in a way that meant something more than soup, and that was enough. At the door, Marin handed her coat back, dry now, fully dry, which Nora had not managed in her city life, even with heaters, and held the door while Nora put it on. The rain was soft this morning, and entirely without urgency, the kind of rain that has nothing to prove. "The notepad," Marin said. Nora looked at her. "Keep writing in it." It was not a suggestion, quite, more like the return of something Nora had left here and was being given back. "I will," Nora said, and then, "How did you know it was helping?" Marin smiled, one of her infrequent, complete smiles, the kind that made her look for a moment like a much younger version of herself, and also, somehow, very old, both at once, as though time were briefly unimportant. "You started sitting differently," she said. "Around the third day, you stopped sitting like someone waiting for the next thing." Nora thought about this. She tried to remember sitting differently, and could not remember the moment, which seemed right. The best changes were like that. They happened in the body before they arrived in the mind, and by the time you noticed them, they were already simply true. She walked to her car. The lane was dark with wet, and the alders arched overhead, making their dripping tunnel, and the forest pressed close on both sides, enormous and real and indifferent in the best possible way. She drove past the fallen madrone and the fork and the gate that was always open, and she turned onto the road, the firs closed in, and after a few miles the sound of the ocean was gone, and after a few more the highway opened up, and the speed increased, and the world resumed its ordinary dimensions. But she drove with the window cracked just a little, enough for the cold January air to come in, enough to hold for another hour the salt smell of the coast, the smell of rain and hemlock and the deep cold water of the Pacific, the smell of a week that had done something to her. She did not entirely understand yet, and was glad of anyway. At Heron Inlet, the fire settled in the hearth, and the rain came on again with its familiar patience. Marin stood at the kitchen window for a moment after the car disappeared around the first bend of the lane, looking at the garden where the winter aconite nodded its yellow heads in the rain, very small, very certain, the color of something beginning. Then she turned and filled the kettle and put it on the stove, and moved through the kitchen in her unhurried way, already thinking about dinner, already tending to whatever was next. Outside, the inlet moved in its daily rhythm, receiving and releasing, the herons at their stations in the shallows, the rain on the water making its 10,000 small circles, each one perfect, each one gone. The gate at the end of the lane was open, as it always was. In the garden, quietly, incrementally, in the dark beneath the soil where no one could see it yet, spring was already turning towards itself. The kettle began to sing.